Well, welcome everyone. We were having some technical difficulties. This is a new platform, I think, for both of us. So we're excited to tell you about this project, and we'll just go ahead and get started since we're a few minutes behind. Okay, so I'm not sure about this platform. If everyone can unmute themselves, we have a pretty small group. So you can use the chat if you'd like, but if you could just, we're going to have a discussion on what comes to mind when you hear flipped learning. So feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat.
At our university, flipped learning is students do work before class, like reviewing material, and then you're in a special classroom with round tables where students talk together and the professor goes around the table. That's how it works.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We've got some things in the chat about engaging with course material before class and then working hands-on in class. All right, so it seems like almost everyone is familiar with the concept of flipped learning, where there's some sort of pre-class material, in-class activities, and then post-class assignments. So before class, they're doing readings, watching videos, maybe taking quizzes. There's something they're completing before class. And then the biggest change is what they're doing in class compared to like traditional lecture, where they come in and they're solving problems or they're having a discussion. So it's more of an application of their knowledge. And then there should be kind of a close of the loop where they're doing something after class, whether it's a reflection or another assignment to just kind of solidify the material. So in the research, we see that flipped learning can improve student-teacher relationships. It results in deeper learning. It helps students apply knowledge. It might improve attendance and even reduce multitasking activity during class. So like sometimes I see students messaging on their computer while they're trying to do other things. And so it tends to reduce that. And it can also improve exam scores when you compare it to just kind of a traditional lecture format. But it can be really challenging for one instructor time to develop pre-class materials, in-class activities, and then the post-class activities can be quite a burden on time. And then getting student buy-in can be a challenge, because if students are resisting or not trusting that flipped learning process, it can be really hard for the instructor and the student. And Teresa and I have done a study on one of these classes that we'll talk about today, where we found that students didn't buy in or really trust into the flipped learning process until about week 6 of the semester, which is almost halfway through. So it took a lot of time for students to adjust to that new format. They were really frustrated with how much time it took to prepare for class. And then they also had some frustration about solving problems on their own, getting the wrong answer at first and then having to readjust and try to figure it out. It's also kind of difficult to measure certain aspects of learning, sometimes things like critical thinking. And then in flipped learning, there's a lack of longer term follow-up. So a lot of studies will look at course evaluations, right after the course, or student perceptions right after the course. But we were more interested in what do they think, 1 to 2 years later, because there are some studies that say students would change their course evaluations later on versus right after the course. So they may have thought differently about it after they've gotten into maybe graduate school for undergrads or their professional careers as grad students. Okay, so we're going to talk about a ISSOTL study that explored how graduate and undergraduate dietetic students, so these are students who want to become registered dietitians, retrospectively perceive a course that used flipped learning 1 to 2 years after they completed the course. So just the basics of the course: there's an undergraduate course and a graduate course that we'll be talking about. They're both focused on kind of metabolism concepts, but just at a different level. So in both classes, they had some sort of preparatory assignment, whether it was readings, videos. In the undergraduate class, they had required quizzes before class. There were also guided reading questions that were optional supports for students to help them through the chapter, because in previous classes, students seemed to have trouble with reading comprehension and note-taking and figuring out what was the most important to pull out from the reading. Those guided reading questions were phased out for graduate students to try to scaffold their ability to take notes. Both classes also used team-based learning. In class, we focused on application. We also had book club discussions in both classes, and they all completed regularly scheduled learning reflections throughout the semester. So a typical day in the class for either one would be students would come in, they'd get a short answer quiz that they could use their notes in their book and their teams. They would complete those, we'd go over it, answer any questions that came up, and then we go into more of our problem solving activities. So they might get some case studies that they have to solve together. And then again, we go over it in class. And then after class, they maybe do a learning reflection. Then they were encouraged to reread the chapter and review their notes. So the graduate class was taught in fall 2018. And then we did the focus group in fall 2020, so 2 years later. The undergraduate class was taught in spring 2019, and the focus group was done in spring 2021. And then we analyzed both focus groups in summer of 2021 using content analysis for the focus group transcripts. And in the focus group, they were asked about flipped learning, what they liked most about it, what they disliked most, what their previous experiences with flipped learning were and how that compared to this class, what they thought about how class time was spent, their role as an independent learner, the purpose of flipped learning, what they thought it was, what they thought of team-based learning, and how they think flipped learning has impacted them, if at all. So we found from the analysis 6 main themes, and there were some differences in graduate and undergraduate students, and Teresa will go over those.
So as Rachel mentioned, we did, through our data analysis, 6 themes emerged. The first was metacognition and the learning process. So students talked about learning how to learn, essentially, or sometimes relearn. They talked about their confidence and ability to learn, and they acknowledged that they have to put in more work to achieve a deeper learning. So we've got quotes on each of the slides with the themes from a graduate student and an undergraduate student. For the graduate student here, they talked about their self-awareness of how they learn on their own. And in the undergraduate quote, the student says, and I feel like I got involved in my learning in a different way that I hadn't really done before. So they're thinking about how they learn and how confident they are in that. The second theme was around roles and responsibilities. And this is one of those themes that the theme of roles and responsibilities came up for both cohorts, but there were definite differences between the graduate and undergraduate level. So there were, the graduate students expected that they would take on responsibility for their learning. They expected that from themselves. The undergraduates were willing to take responsibility if it was expected of them, but in a traditional lecture class, they felt like it was still the teacher's responsibility. So they were willing to give the teacher responsibility if that was possible, or they'd take it up on their own if they had to. So you can see the quotes here for the graduate student. I feel like I was actually participating in class, not just listening or like zoning out. I had an active role in class. And so they're acknowledging that they had a role in class and they were responsible for their learning. So a couple questions, or a question for you to think about. What are your reactions to the undergraduate perception that if an instructor uses primarily lecture, it's not their responsibility to try and learn on their own? You can unmute and say, give your reaction, or you can add it in the chat, either one.
If I can just start the conversation, I think it depends on the traditional lecture. If I think of me as an undergraduate, which is 30 years ago, of course I had to take responsibility because the prof just threw notions at us, and then we had to figure everything out. We didn't, we would write on paper and well. But now a traditional lecture is already different. You often get a PowerPoint, there's a website. So maybe the student knows less that they have to take responsibility now more than before when we were just thrown in the water and expected to swim.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting perspective I hadn't even considered yet.
Mm-hmm.
The reaction I had as we did the analysis is that they just expect someone to hand it to them. This is what you should know, versus them having to try to struggle through what's important, what do I need to take from this? It's an interesting comment in the chat that it may come from even before they're in undergraduate studies.
It really surprised me that having if the instructor has a lecture the first day, what kind of message the student interprets from that. I just couldn't believe they had made that leap.
The third theme that emerged was collaborative learning. Students talked about having a safe space to ask questions, that they were comfortable being able to ask questions. In the quotes that we have here, they talk a lot about asking questions of their peers, but there were other comments in the transcripts about them being comfortable just asking questions in class. They had more time or opportunity for questions. So in some of their other classes, they didn't feel like there was an opportunity for them to even ask. And they were able to build relationships with their peers and learn from their peers. So if you can read through the quotes here, they could depend on their peers to learn. So they did talk about kind of that being able to learn from each other. So in the graduate quote there, I was able to ask my peers, not somebody that's kind of intimidating like your professor. So they felt a little more comfortable with that. In the undergraduate quote towards the end, I really like that, they mentioned we all kind of contributed. And so they did talk about, contributing to each other's learning. So what are some things some of you have done to create that safe space for making mistakes or for student questions? And do you think it's a product of the flipped learning or team-based learning in this case? I agree with Nadia. Some of it is a product of having time, providing that space for them to ask questions. I didn't quite catch who said that, but I saw think, pair, share. I use that a lot in my classes, and it does kind of help students kind of get comfortable with their answers before they have to share in front of everyone. They've kind of tested it out on a peer first. I think sometimes sharing my own questions helps, that letting them know I don't have every single answer either. I have questions too. All right, the fourth theme that emerged was the class experience. They mentioned that class activities were engaging, they added variety, class time allowed them to apply their knowledge, they enjoyed active learning over that traditional lecture. I particularly like the undergraduate quote here that said that towards the end, it definitely was more of an experience, meaning the flipped class was more experiential. So they talked a lot about just, it being more engaging in general, and that it was an experience. The fifth theme was an adjustment to flipped learning. Most students talked about it being very frustrating at first and even overwhelming. I think the course material could be overwhelming, that it's an intense kind of material with metabolism, but just feeling like they had to learn a new way to learn was frustrating. We got the sense that all the graduate students and some of the undergraduate students were able to adjust to this learning, but some of the undergraduate students may not have fully adjusted. Even towards the end of their, time, that maybe they weren't not completely bought in, and they often wanted more instructor guidance as undergraduate students. Even though they had kind of accepted that this was how the class was set up, they still wanted that extra support, extra guidance from the teacher. A lot of students, if you can see the undergraduate student there, talks about, I was teaching myself everything. That was a fairly common comment throughout the transcripts, that they felt like they were teaching themselves. They got frustrated with it. But then at the end, they did note that it was cleared up during class, and so it was fine. So they kind of accepted it, but I don't think they totally loved it either. So there is an adjustment period. So have any of you experienced that student frustration in your own classes? And are there ways that you have overcome that? How do you deal with that challenge?
We have, I don't do a flip classroom, but we have a jigsaw activity where they have to prepare, so once, 3 times during the semester. And they're really frustrated that they didn't know the answer before coming to class, and they were ending something wrong because they have to end it by writing. And then they discuss with each other and realize that the others don't know really the answer. And at the end, I do a group discussion about this after the first one. There's no only one answer. What would you do differently for the next one, knowing that you probably don't have the whole MU? So they realize that it's everyone. I tell them the other years were the same. I say everyone is like this. And so the second time they just come in, well, this is what I thought. It's probably wrong, but this is what I thought. So I think because they're third-year student, they in 6 months they're going to be biologists, so they should be ready to do this. So I tell them this also. It's in the real world. There are no textbook to tell you the answer. So otherwise they would be really frustrated at me.
Thank you. They do struggle. So we both teach in dietetics, and they struggle a lot with, they want a very black and white right answer. And so when there's no specific right answer, they do struggle with that. So it takes a little while maybe to get used to that. So the last and 6th theme was that there are conditions for whether flipped learning would be effective. So flipped learning is conditional. Students talk about, it's not going to work for all classes. Your students need to be really interested in that subject matter for it to be effective. They need to be motivated to learn. Class size is an issue. It's, probably needs to be a smaller class. The textbook makes a difference. The actual physical space of the classroom makes a difference. And so we did include a quote about that. The subject of the course would matter, and even the level of the student. So the graduate student kind of mentions that flipped learning isn't going to work for an intro level or maybe even for a sophomore level, but 3rd or 4th year might work, and definitely graduate students. The undergraduate is mentioning there that, they had to move their desks, and, how that was kind of a challenge to the flipped learning situation. So do any of you have you struggled with flipping a particular class due to any of those reasons, or even a different reason? And are there classes that you've used flipped learning for that you think are non-traditional? I noticed at the very beginning someone mentioned that what they thought about flipped learning, and you mentioned round tables and people sitting at round tables. And so the undergraduate student, that classroom had individual desks that they had to kind of move around. Anyone else with experience in flipped learning? So interesting, sophomore level statistics, that would be an interesting flipped class.
I think that was one that was specifically mentioned in the focus group transcripts. That would not be a good idea. So that's very interesting.
Well, it must be working if they're continuing to do it for a few years.
Mm-hmm.
Writing for social work. So I also do some semi-flipped classes. So I have a junior level course that I say is semi-flipped, that I do still lecture some days. I still try to make it an engaging lecture where I'm asking questions and we're still having some discussion, but it is a more lecture based on some days versus all activities. All right, well, I think that is it for our discussion. So we have the 6 themes, and hopefully that was beneficial. I appreciate any of the interaction that we had, and we've got our references listed there. Does anyone have questions?
There's a question in the chat about how our findings differed from findings right after the completion of the course. I would say the biggest difference were the undergraduate students. So the graduate students, they did buy in, pretty early on in the semester, and I think they saw the benefits of it when they were in it. The undergraduate students, they were pretty resistant and frustrated all semester. And so I was surprised to see that some of them saw the point of it, a couple years later, where they're in dietetic internships with students from other universities, and they would tell their new classmates about activities they had done in this class 2 years ago that really stuck with them. So I think the biggest growth was for undergraduate students.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of just answered that next question about the time lag. The grad students just seemed to buy into it even more. And then the undergrads, although not unanimously, I think some still would prefer traditional lecture. Some saw the benefit over time. So Nadia, your question is about students with different capacities, for example, reading. No, not really. We did a study on the graduate level course, just kind of looking at the reflections over time, two cohorts before this one, and we realized that was a real struggle for students. So that's why we added those guided reading questions, and that really seemed to help them. So that's kind of how I try to address that, but that was definitely a point where students struggled a lot, both grad and undergrad, the reading comprehension and learning from textbooks.
Because if I give them an authentic situation, it's a preparation, and then there are questions, just reading that paragraph, they go in circle and they try to see what is important in there, and it's also difficult to read. It takes them a long time. So I started making a video of me reading the question, so the people who can hear, and students who don't struggle said it helped them too. So I realized that when I was pushing text on them to read before class, some of them were very disadvantaged. So maybe some answers were about that, maybe in the undergraduate. That's what I was.
Someone asked how large each of the classes were. The graduate class was 10 students, and the undergraduate was 16 that year. So pretty small. And then any other pre-class learning, I did have videos. So usually several, very short videos. They weren't like recorded lectures. They were YouTube videos that had lots of animations that really helped with metabolic processes. And then of course they had the optional guided reading questions, and the undergrads had a required reading quiz. The graduate students did not. Well, thank you everybody for attending and for your participation, and have a nice rest of your day, evening, morning, whatever it is for you.
Yes, thank you everyone. Have a good conference.